have our guest speaker today. We also have people online, so I hope they can hear us. We have a special guest to our Brussels to the Bay event, co-organized with the Consulate General of Norway. And the special guest, as everyone knows, is the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights, Volker Türk. Thank you very much for being here with us. Let me just say in 30 seconds, for those who don't know yet, the EU opened its office here in September 2022. And we did that because it was high time to be here to promote the values, the democratic values and human rights in tech applications via what we're doing in the EU, not only to just advertise the digital legislation, but to bring closer to the states on the West Coast, because we have a representation on the East Coast, to bring closer the values that so many people, so many of our partners here share. And when we have arrived, to our positive surprise, we thought we would be welcomed, but we were so welcomed, and we met so much. This whole thing of setting up an EU presence on the West Coast brought so much interest that here we are at our 12th Brussels to the Bay event. It's a policy series that brings together the Americans, the EU people, the member states from the EU, the like-minded countries. Anyone is welcome to our events. These events are public. This is not Chatham House rules. We're very happy to talk about how the EU, how the UN works together to strengthen democracy in the online world and offline world. I'll pass the floor to Gru, and then I'll pass it on to Alexis, who is our fantastic moderator, and I'm so happy to have her with us. She will introduce our speakers and run the show. Over to you, Gru.
Thank you, Joanna, and High Commissioner, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this event. We're so happy to co-organize this with the EU office. My name is Gry Henriksen. I'm Consul General for Norway here in San Francisco. It's hard to overstate the importance of today's topic, how to safeguard the integrity of elections. This is essentially about safeguarding democracy and free and open societies, our way of life. And it's not a theoretical question. We have already seen elections being effectively manipulated. We are in the elections super year, where the world's largest democracies and a host of other countries are going to the polls. So a lot is at stake. We want to harness what technology can bring to promote democracy while making sure we have guardrails in place. Like for most complex challenges, electoral integrity can only be achieved if a whole range of stakeholders work together. International organizations, industry, governments, and civil society all have roles to play. And that, to reflect that here today, we have brought together some worlds that are seemingly far apart: the dynamic, innovation, and technology-driven Bay Area, the United Nations, an indispensable provider of global norms, and the EU, the regulatory superpower of the world's second largest economy. And I'm convinced that we're in for an interesting and important discussion here today. And so I'd like to thank our co-organizers, first my good colleagues from the EU office, Gerard and Joanna and their team, and mine, for this collaboration, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Stephanie here, representing them here in San Francisco. Thank you to the panelists for your participation, and to our moderator, Alexis Witkowski, for your continued engagement in discussions on the intersection between technology, societies, and international relations. And last but not least, I would like to extend a special thanks to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk, for having the wisdom to come here all the way from Geneva to engage with us. Thank you. And over to you, Alexis.
Can you hear me? This is the most important technology check of the day. Does my microphone work? And we've confirmed that. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Alexis Witkowski. I'm currently at Columbia University as a professor of professional practice on technology, and I've been working largely in government technology for many, many years. So in some ways, this feels like coming home. I was at the State Department's mission to the United Nations for a long time. I've forgotten some of my diplomatic protocols, so forgive me if I get things a little off in order. We're going to hear very soon from our distinguished panelists, and as was mentioned, this is an open event. And this is one of the things that I think America has a lot to learn from what the EU is doing and how the UN works, is that it is not one country's challenge or issue or problem, what we do with technology and how we make sure that it serves the rights of all people and makes our lives better. It is something that we need to have everyone involved in that conversation, not just behind closed doors. So having this event be open and transparent is, I think, a wonderful, not just fact, but also a model for the rest of us to follow. We're here today to discuss strengthening democracies and election integrity, which in my mind means rules and rights, because who gets to decide what technology we use? And how do we make sure that the people who have a right to do so can do so in free and fair elections? This is something that I'm looking forward to discussing more deeply with the experts that we have here. But I just wanted to say first that this is a topic that I hope that we acknowledge not just the people in the room are paying attention to. We have a Zoom audience that is international. And so what we do here today is not just a conversation for conversation's sake. This is something that people really need to have guidance on. So the EU and the UN have been global leaders on providing that guidance for many, many years. And now that you're here in the Bay Area and that you're here in San Francisco, hopefully we can do more of these kinds of events and have more of this guidance to share more broadly. With that, I'm going to call our panelists up to the front. We are going to have, now I do have to refer to my notes to make sure I don't get anyone's name wrong. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, Volker Türk, Gerard de Graaf, who is the Senior UN Envoy for Digital to the US. Online, we have Prabhat Agrawal, who I believe will be joining us via Zoom on the magic of technology over here. Naomi Schiffman from the Venice Oversight Board, she's the head of data and implementation, and David Evan Harris, serving as Chancellor's Public Scholar at UC Berkeley. They all have ridiculously impressive bios. I'm going to let you read those online. And we're going to start for a moment just turning things over to the discussion. The way this will work is we'll have questions that I will share with our panelists, and then at some point with 20 minutes, maybe towards the end of the event, we'll go to an online question and then questions from the room. So with that, I'm going to take my seat, and we have a microphone to pass. So much. You get the first question. So, High Commissioner, we have heard a lot about the challenges with information, disinformation, misinformation, and the way that it impacts elections specifically. So what are your views on how we can do anything about this? What kinds of challenges that we face, but what are our options in addressing those challenges?
I'll start with a more existential issue. And it's really about the fundamentals of what democratic space means and why we actually need a democratic space and a free and fair one in order to be able to decide who we are going to vote for. I mean, as you know, the background is this is probably going to be the mega election year. We have 4 billion people who are going to vote in new governance systems in one way or another. And in about 70 countries. I mean, we have already seen a number of these elections take place. But in order to actually elect the people that you feel represented by, you need to know and you need to find a way to get the information that you need. You need to find out what type of programs are they representing, what are they going to do when they're in power. And as you know, I'm Austrian, so I have a very close link with the European Union. There was one philosopher, Popper, who wrote, not least as a result of the experience, Karl Popper, during the well, in the interwar period of the last century, but also during the Second World War, he wrote this very famous book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. So I was often wondering, what would he write today if he were to take into account the massive ability to make sure that you have a lot of enemies to the open society? And I'm sure he would write about the digital side of things, because on the one hand, it can provide an incredible amount of wealth of information, but we also know the shadow side, and we have seen it during the pandemic. We have seen it also in elections a couple of years ago, also in this country. We have seen that you can actually make sure that you have a space where the type of issues that need to be discussed are based on lies, the denial of facts. There's a famous book by Michiko Kakutani, The Death of Truth. And we see this not just in the democratic space, we also see it when it comes to the conflicts and the wars. Truth is the first victim, not just of some of the things when you actually want to put forward extremist views and populist views, or when you also are trying to make sure that you create a distrust between the people among themselves and the people and the institutions of the state. And that's extremely worrying. And of course, the digital side is not, it starts with the offline world, because that's what the offline world is about. Technology enables the worst instincts and the best instincts in our own human history. So I think we need to be, and it can amplify things and accelerate things and including, hate speech, disinformation, and so forth. This is extremely, extremely worrying. But on the other hand, and we are a global institution, and we cannot just look at the global north. We are obviously also very keen to see what's happening in many countries around the world. About 74% of the world's population lives in autocratic type settings. You can imagine the suppression of information, the restrictions to civic space, the overreach when it comes to disinformation, censorship is a very serious human rights issue as well, because we have often seen, and you have an interesting discussion now on the Cybercrime Convention as we speak, you have actually seen the overreach in some of these respects. And so it brings us back to what are the guiding principles, and the guiding principles that is human rights law. You have in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you have the checks and balances that are actually there, and they need to be used, and they need to be used both offline and online. And there are exceptions to freedom of expression and freedom of information, access to information, and it has to be provided by law. There are legitimate grounds to restrict some of it, but it has to be done by law, and it has to be proportionate, and it has to be necessary. And that's the type of work that needs to be done on a daily basis, both when it comes to states and governments, when they regulate, but also when it comes to companies. And we can talk a little bit more about, the human rights responsibilities that companies have themselves, especially if they are as powerful as they are here in the Bay Area.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to getting into some of the details of how that actually can take place, not just at the policy and regulatory level, but how do you actually do this work? And this is where I think we're going to start getting into some of those details as we move along the line down to our other panelists. So, Gerard, you have the honor of being the first EU representative, senior envoy of the EU to the US. The EU has a very powerful presence globally in making sure that there are regulations to protect human rights in the digital world. And so one of the things I want to ask is to get into this question of how do we do this? It's all wonderful to say we agree human rights should be protected in this space, but how do we make sure that it actually happens? So based on your experience, what have you seen be particularly effective in making sure that human rights are part of the conversation and how technology is used? And also, what do you think is missing from what we've seen so far?
One technical point, look at me when you speak because the camera for the online.
Okay, good. So not look at the audience, just look at. Sorry, it's just. I mean, you're not giving me a very easy question to start with. I thought we get a bit of a warming up and then I get going, but so immediately we could have been almost a kind of impossible question to answer, at least in the like probably 2 or 3 minutes that I've got. I first want to. I mean, we talk about digital, but I think there's an incredibly important dimension that is not digital. I mean, issues around equality in society. I mean, the economic anxiety you also see in this country. I mean, the kind of democracy needs to show to people that it is a superior model compared to autocracy, dictatorship. So the quality and access to healthcare, education, all of these things. I mean, I think that's what, I mean, obviously digital then comes in and magnifies some of these kind of trends that you see in, but I mean, I think there's much more than digital is a part of the problem and it can kind of make the problem much worse. But I think we must not forget that there's a wider kind of, I mean, we talk about society and how society is organized and opportunity and these things and quality of information. I mean, we look a lot at like the ecosystem. I mean, I'm of the generation, I read newspapers. I mean, my kids don't read newspapers. I would watch television and it was all like, I mean, at least informed. And lots of newspapers have disappeared. I just looked up, for example, I mean, the revenue of newspapers last year was less than 10 billion. Only 20 years ago, it was 50, 60 billion. I mean, the newspapers have been ravaged by the digital ecosystem because advertising, of course, has gyrated, has moved towards the platforms away from the newspapers, from investigative journalism. So I think we need to just not focus only on like the digital side, but more on the whole kind of societal and economic dimensions. I mean, one thing you need is rules. I mean, we've had long, and I think maybe something we're now learning with AI. I mean, there has been this kind of tendency not to really, I mean, to intervene in digital markets or in social media. It was move fast and break things. And so like the first 10 years of social media, certainly, I mean, was Wild West, was free reign for the digital companies. And I think that now governments are coming back and say, well, wait a second, I mean, we need to kind of steer this in a different direction. The direction in which this is going is not the direction that like we want it to go because our values aren't fully taken into account. I mean, there is a capacity in terms of scale of social media in particular to promote deception, to basically brainwash people and then to say, look, we don't have editorial responsibility. It's not us, it's people uploading content. And so we wash our hands at this. That kind of, I think we made a turning point in the European Union about, I think 5-6 years ago, saying, well, this cannot continue. And how then the question that was asked, well, what do we do? And part of it, you have to put rules in place because rules are enforceable. I mean, they are decided through democratic processes. And the platform's model, as we know, is one of engagement. I mean, that's how they make money. And that's not necessarily aligned with the public interest. I mean, they are looking for eyeballs because it's advertising, more people see it. And so the content that sells and that engages people, unfortunately, because that's like the way people are, is a bit more controversial, is kind of maybe not always based on the truth. And so that you need to put, and that's what the European Union has done, responsibilities on the platforms and accountability and transparency, because a lot of what they do is a big black box. We have no idea. We had no idea. Now suddenly we're finding out. For example, with the DSA, and I leave it to Prabhat, my brilliant colleague, to talk more about the DSA, but we're now finding out, which we didn't know before, is how they are moderating content in the European Union. Simple facts like how many content moderators are there. I mean, talking about elections, I remember our Commissioner Breton being here in San Francisco 8-9 months ago, a few months before the Slovak elections in September, and he asked one of the very big tech platforms, like, how many content moderators do you have that speak or understand the Slovak language? And the answer of a very, very big platform was, we have one. And that, of course, does not kind of give us the confidence that the platform is capable of actually moderating the content and weeding out, or at least intervening when, and as we've seen in Slovakia, there has been attempts and I mean, to influence the elections. And if a big platform has no capacity and not the willingness, I think what it really takes as well, and that's why you need regulation, is platforms making this a priority. As long as these platforms still see trust and safety, as it's called, as a cost center, as something that costs money, so not a priority, we will not see change. And that with regulation that is enforceable, and if there are, if there's evidence, and we've got cases out now against certain of these platforms that they are not taking it sufficiently seriously, they will feel the consequences. And that's the way to get behavior to change.
That's extremely helpful and also startling about the one content moderator. This actually is a great segue to our guest on the screen, who you referred to, Prabhat, who you're in the weeds of this, of how you actually make this happen. And it is an awesome job, and it must be an impossible job. So if you could, in a nutshell, talk us through how you do this. How do you enforce change in the EU through the DSA or these other regulations, you know, in 2 to 3 minutes?
Thanks a lot. That's a difficult question, and it's a pleasure to try and answer it. I mean, in a nutshell, I have a great team, so that's the way to do it, you know. And not only do I have a great team, but I also have a very powerful commissioner in Commissioner Breton, who is leading this, and an executive vice president, Margarete Vestager, who are really kind of the captains of the overall project. But it's a new framework. It's been in place for a little over a year in law. The first obligations for the very large online platforms started applying last September, and actually we're heading this weekend into another big deadline, is when the entire framework unfolds, also not just for the very big platforms that we all hear about, like TikTok or X or Meta and the search engines, but also for the smaller platforms for whom the compliance deadline is this coming Saturday. And in fact, for the first time next Monday, and this is a very important element on how to make this work, we're convening all the national regulators of the 27 member states of the European Union here in Brussels, who will be federating the enforcement of the Digital Services Act. So this is going to be a framework that will be enforced by my team here in Brussels, which are about 120 growing to 180 by the end of this summer, but federating, you know, hundreds of regulators in member states together and to jointly work on a series of actions. I think for the meeting that we have today in San Francisco, and I have to say that Gerard de Graaf, when he was in Brussels, was my boss and was one of the fathers of this whole framework. So I think that he didn't mention it out of modesty in the introduction, but it's you have the conceptual father in the room. So I'm sure that over drinks afterwards, you'll be able to hear many great stories. But at the moment, one of our key focus priority areas is election integrity, and it was already mentioned by the High Commissioner in the beginning. We have observed a number of European elections, starting with the Slovakian election in September 2023, where we were on site with our teams, and we convened all the major social media platforms who were operating in Slovakia. And this is one of the elections in the European Union where recently there was an audio deepfake. An opposition politician was recorded, or supposedly recorded, in what turned out to be a deepfake recording, which was deeply incriminating and making false allegations about him. And this was for us already a wake-up call. It wasn't the first time that something like this happened, but it was very startling that it happened just a few days after the Digital Services Act entered into force. And I can tell you the companies were not ready to deal with this at the time. So we've been working with companies, observing different elections, Slovakia, Poland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and recently the Finnish presidential elections. Not every election is the same. Of course, there are countries like Finland have very high media literacy, and the threat to a disruption by disinformation campaigns is lower. There are other countries where platforms have a good presence in the site, so it's different. And so we've just put out election guidelines for draft consultations, and that are open, and I'm sure the colleagues from the San Francisco office can share them. And it deals with a whole bunch of issues on how platforms should prepare for threats, including 11th hour threats to elections, and also with issues such as deepfakes coming up. And we're hoping that this is the start of a very important transatlantic conversation. So I'll stop here just to give you a little bit of a flavor, and I look forward to the discussion as it continues.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned 3 words that I'm going to hand over to our next panelist here in terms of how we make this work. How do we actually move from policy and ideas and move into where this is a part of our reality? You have a deadline. Everybody loves a deadline. It's something to make sure that everybody gets in line at a certain point in time. You have teams of people that are working on it. Obviously, one content moderator who speaks a language is not going to be very helpful. You need actual people to do the work. And then you said something about enforcement. So I want to pass this over to our next panelist, Naomi Schiffman, who is at the Oversight Board, precisely to talk about how do we make sure we don't just set rules, but make sure that they're being enforced and followed. And so from your perspective in the work that you do, love to hear how you see this work or how it could work better.
Thank you. So the Oversight Board, right, is a separate organization from Meta. It can make non-binding recommendations to Meta around policy, product enforcement operations. And my team's job is to figure out, how do we know if those recommendations are actually being accepted? How can we see in the data, right, if we're seeing a change in user behavior or in the platform ecosystem? And so I want to highlight 2 things, right? One is that I think when the board got started, there was this idea that you can have nuance at scale. You can have nuanced, complex policies accurately enforced at scale. That turns out to not be true. You're always going to have enforcement errors. And so often what we're looking at when we're making recommendations is we're asking to improve underlying systems, such as detection for certain types of content, and asking Meta to demonstrate that they're reducing the amount of enforcement errors. We're also asking for transparency about the trade-offs that come into play when they're making those decisions. I think as the DSA comes into force and the EU is really trying to understand, is it working, right? Part of it is making sure that you're getting the right data to understand whether the recommendations are having the intended impact on the systems. So I'll give a couple examples from our work. One has been around nudity content. This is a very common issue on platforms. It's often violating policies, but not violating, laws. And so it's a flexible place to experiment. So we made recommendations, for example, to improve detection of content that is actually about breast cancer awareness, rather than just straight violating the nudity policy. And the data that we requested as proof that it was working was the reduction of false positives of identified content, right? So we ended up getting data that demonstrated more content was being routed for human review rather than being automatically removed as a result of those classifier improvements, of those detection improvements for the policy. So it's a bit of a technical example, but I think it shows how if you're trying to put this regulation into practice, you need to have a pipeline for getting the data that is going to prove that we're seeing a change in behavior or a change in what is actually being left up on the platform.
It's a very helpful example. And I think that's an important introduction also to what other kinds of mechanisms are out there besides regulations, rules, policies. Is what is the data showing us? Is it actually being effective? And this is also a very handy segue over to our last panelist on the row here, David Evan Harris, currently Chancellor's Public Scholar at UC Berkeley, My understanding is that you also have some experience in this department working at the entity that used to be known as just Facebook. So based on your time there or the work that you've done since, what do you think is the way to go? Is it just the guidelines and the rules and the policies? Do we need the data? Do we need something even stronger to make sure that we're seeing behavior change with the platforms?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So indeed, I was an employee of Meta or Facebook, and then Meta from 2018 till 2023. And the conclusion that I came to after working on the election integrity team, spending some time on the misinformation team, the responsible AI team, was that the objectives that I had in the company and that the teams I worked on had would not be achieved without firm regulation. And it's a complicated set of reasons why that happens, but I think in the conversation we're having, it's actually useful to look back to something that happened in 2018. But just before then, Tristan Harris, an activist, former Google employee, started using this term "time well spent" to talk about how people were spending more time than they probably should and wanted to online. Mark Zuckerberg adopted that exact same phrase, and he actually made a number of talks where he said, we want people's time on Facebook to be time well spent. We don't want them to watch so many viral videos. And in many cases, viral videos were the culprit. And so Facebook made an investment in trying to move people away from that. There are a lot of questions about how exactly that took place, but then fast forward a couple of years, what platform is eating Facebook's lunch? TikTok, with viral videos. And so when the companies, in the absence of regulation, try to do the right thing, they'll pay a price for it. When companies invest a lot in election integrity, in trust and safety, and then their competitors decide not to, investors catch on. Elon Musk famously eliminated 82% of Twitter's employees. Mark Zuckerberg said a few months later that he admired what a lean company Elon had been able to make Twitter. And Meta has been eliminating roles in all of those spaces, and not just trust and safety. The entire civic integrity team was eliminated before Elon got there. Then teams like responsible innovation, responsible AI have been eliminated entirely. And I don't think we can expect the platforms to put the investment that is required into dealing with human rights challenges without firm regulation. And now, as an American, when I talk about regulation and how important it is of social media, the first thing most Americans say to me is, oh, but the First Amendment, oh, freedom of speech. Well, I think a lot of people don't understand that there are many, many ways to regulate social media platforms in favor of human rights without damaging freedom of speech. And that's something, if you actually take the time to read the EU's Digital Services Act, you see in many places in the text, it says that these provisions must not restrict people's freedom of expression. And that's why the DSA is described by some scholars as creating what's called a regulatory dialogue between the regulator and the companies, where the companies provide information about the risks that they're seeing on the platforms. They become increasingly transparent. They participate in dialogues that are required to develop and comply with codes of practice for industry. But the Digital Services Act does not change what is illegal or legal speech. That's not part of it. And I think one last thing I'll say is another case for firm regulation. If you are using these platforms, how often do you see child sexual abuse material or terrorist recruiting in your newsfeed? Probably not much. I don't see those things in my newsfeed. That's because those are illegal content in the United States and most of the world. But how much election misinformation do we see? That proliferates because there are no laws about it. And I think that is such a clear distinction. And again, there are many ways to address election misinformation without impinging on freedom of speech. And one last point I'll add that none of the other panelists mentioned was the importance of fact checking. So there is an entire industry of third-party fact-checking organizations. There's a credentialing program for these organizations. Many of these organizations sit within established and respected journalism organizations, and they are largely dependent on the whims of the platforms for their revenue and their investment. And when the platforms decide, oh, it looks like the pressure's off and we can get away with less, then there's less investment. Fact-checking is a hugely important industry that needs to be part of regulatory efforts. The companies need to engage fact-checkers. And maybe going back to something that the High Commissioner said at the beginning, the death of truth. When we adopt the position that many of the platforms have taken, that truth, we never really knew what that was anyway, is that really important? That's a really big problem. And sure, there are lots of situations where two reasonable fact checkers might disagree on something, but there are a lot more where people who are trained in how to assess whether something is true or false can come to agreement on something, and where clear information can be provided on that to the public. And just think that's so important. I'll end there.
Thank you so much for raising all of these points. And there's so many things to respond to. I'm going to make sure that our panelists can. Speaking of election information, specifically in election integrity, which is why we're here, you mentioned you don't see, most of us, content that is illegal, or that is kind of universally recognized to be bad. For instance, terrorist recruiting information, child pornography, for instance. Is there something that can be done at a global level to address this other issue about misinformation around elections, when we have, as you mentioned, High Commissioner, 70% of countries that don't maybe have elections, or not free and fair ones at least? So I'm wondering about this nuance between having the rules and regulations and the laws that say this content is not okay, when 70% of the world maybe isn't going to have those laws and rules. If we could pass the mic back over to our Commissioner,
yeah,
and tackle this very easy question.
Look, at the global level, I mean, I should go back to the pandemic, actually. During the pandemic, as you know, there was a lot of concern, first of all, about global inequities and inequalities that happen around the world. So I'm not going to look at you, I have to look at the camera, and not at the audience either. No, so during the pandemic, there was an incredible amount of harmful disinformation about the pandemic itself, about the vaccine, about the treatment, about all kinds of things. And it actually really harmed people as a result. So one of the things that we in the United Nations at the time were thinking about is to actually, and we saw this also, of course, in various elections that happened before. So there are a number of things that came together, and this erosion of trust, we talked about almost you need a social contract within a society in order for it to function. You need to be able to trust the institutions. You need to be able to trust the other, and you need some form of social cohesion and consensus within a society in order to be able to tackle the problems that we face, in order to elect the leaders that are out there, in order to find the type of governance that is required and that actually responds to the needs of and the rights of people. So then the issue came up, how can we address disinformation, misinformation, fact-checking, and frankly, even public integrity? Because I think one of the big issues that you have also mentioned is, in the past you had, newspapers, you had the traditional media, but of course they've all more or less been replaced by various other social media platforms and so forth, that perhaps in and of itself are not, their business model is not necessarily one to provide the type of information that the journalists are, especially when they do their work correctly, trying to be free and independent media and information providers, which you don't necessarily have within a democratized social media platform. And then, so the issue then came, should we not arrive at a code of conduct for integrity when it comes to public information? And that is actually being worked out at the moment. And it really looks at free and independent media, the type of information ecosystem that you need so that people can actually, based on facts, decide who they vote for, what type of information do they access, and for what purpose. And to make sure, especially when it comes to the fact-checking side, and I think you mentioned it, I think that's really important because there is so much viral hate speech, disinformation going around that actually makes societies very toxic and polarized and divided. And we really need to find ways and means to counter it. So at the global level, it's tried to be done with this, if you like, a global code of conduct on integrity in public information.
So we have all of these different scales that we're working at the global level, and then also within the very large companies, big tech itself. I'm going to ask Naomi if you might comment on this question of nuance at scale, which you mentioned is part of the challenge. How do you effectively enforce or identify if companies are enforcing the changes in behavior you'd like to see? As David pointed out, you can do all the good things you want and remove viral content, and then some other company will crop up and take over all your market and eat your lunch, so to speak. How do we resolve this from your perspective on the oversight board?
Thank you. Yeah.
Excuse me.
So I think that what we've seen is that asking for transparency about the amount of harmful content that is on platforms, and this is something the DSA has really put at the core of its implementation, is a really effective tool for kind of shedding light on the challenges and also setting a bar, right, amongst platforms. If we can say, well, we know that the sort of average amount of a certain type of harmful content on a platform or a certain amount of content removed on a platform is X%, then if we see a platform that's kind of way, way above that, then, you know, we have a means of sort of pulling them back into line, right? Hopefully through some sort of industry agreement. You know, or we have somebody, a platform that is way below, that is doing something to have an even lower amount of that content on the platform, and are we learning, you know, do we learn best practices from them? I mean, we see this in the financial industry in the United States all the time, right? There's cross-industry standards that are agreed upon by the businesses and then are regulated by the SEC at the federal level. So potentially we can see something like that for platforms as well, right? There's a industry standard, like spam, for example, on platforms. I believe the industry standard is around like 3% of content is spam, and that's considered sort of like okay. When we start to set those levels for harmful content, right, we start getting a lot more teeth in enforcement.
The comment about transparency is fantastic. And as you mentioned, in addition to it creating something that an oversight body could hold a company to account for, also for investors to make decisions and not necessarily just pull their money from one platform who's trying to do a good thing and put it to somewhere else where they're not, because that's bad optics. So one of the reasons I bring this up is, I think one of the challenges, as you've identified, High Commissioner, is this issue of trust and reality and kind of the breakdown of these social contracts where people have a role to play. And it's not just about what can be regulated and enforced, but also the people themselves trust and have confidence that it's going to work. So I'm curious to hear about what we can do from your perspectives, your various perspectives. And maybe we'll start with Gerard. I know that there's a lot of activity happening with these deadlines in the EU starting this weekend to communicate to people we are doing things, we're getting things done. We are finding not small amounts of money for not complying. We are making change happen to rebuild that trust. So if you could maybe address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're facing a phenomenal challenge here. I mean, democracy is who we are. I mean, it represents our values. And if you see how powerful the internet is and digital is, and we're really up against, a fundamental force in our societies. And I'm afraid to say it's going to get worse before it's going to get better, because with deep fakes and the capabilities of AI to spread this information at scale, to micro-target it, I mean, to be very much more sophisticated. I mean, if you think about the US elections that are coming here, I mean, the 2016 election was, it hinged on about maybe 100,000 votes. And so it's perfectly possible nowadays to identify the counties. So you talk about swing states, within these swing states, the counties, the people, and then target them with like misinformation or trying to kind of maybe not get them out to vote is perfectly possible. And just with that kind of like surgical intervention that AI and all of the technology that exists nowadays would permit, you can swing an election from one side to another. So I think the challenges, I mean, I'm saying this because I don't want to say, look, well, the EU has now adopted the DSA, and so now you can go to bed and it's all going to be fine and perfect, and the tide has turned and you can trust again. I think this is one important step. I think without rules, we're not going to get there. We need to get up to speed. We need to, I think this is not an issue where you can just point to the EU. You can just point to the DSA and say, okay, now great. I mean, now let's then focus on other issues that like are bothering the world. So I think we have to make sure now that the DSA works. I think one thing is that, I mean, there's no perfect here. I mean, we have to just, it's all steps that we all have to take collectively. I think one of the nice things about the DSA, it isn't just the commission, I mean, Prabhat's team. I mean, it's all of us. We can play a role. It's the fact checkers. It's us as individuals. There's a notice and action system. I mean, the civil society, researchers have access to data of social media. Independent auditors come in and they look under the hood and they can see the kind of whether maybe some of the data are not what they think, we think they tell us. And I think that I think is a collective responsibility. And then going back to like, this is digital, but I mean, we need to show that democracy is the superior model. If I look at like the global South, there's so much opportunity of technology. I mean, there are 32 countries in the world that have supercomputers that are actually kind of capable of developing, for example, these large language models. So there's more than 160, 170 that don't have these technologies. If we can bring some of like the positives, we're talking a lot now about the negatives of technology, the positives of technology to the global South that enables democratic governments to provide better healthcare, better education, I mean, more transparent government, I mean, less corruption, I mean, smart mobility, smart energy use. I mean, that's how you win hearts and minds of people. I mean, of course, elections is like once every 4 years or 5 years, people come and then they express what they think about, say, the government that has been in power and whether it deserves another term or it needs to be replaced. But the important thing is that democracy needs to show that it is a better model than autocracy, and technology can help there in very, very important ways. I mean, and so that's, I think, something that's, so yes, look at the DSA and we are trying. DSA is a very complicated measure. We've talked a lot with countries around the world. There's very few countries around the world, maybe none other than the EU not being a country, that is capable of enforcing, adopting the DSA. You need political will to do that. We have it in the European Union. Not all countries, democratic countries, have it. This country doesn't have it. And then secondly, you need to have the capacity to enforce the DSA, which is not to be underestimated. So I think what we need to be looking for, and this is, I think, where we need to cooperate very closely with the UN, is like certain modules. Where do you start? Maybe you start with transparency, so we know better like what social media platforms is doing. I mean, if we are concerned about one content moderator in Slovakia, how many content moderators you think there are for Angola or Myanmar? I mean, probably not more than one, if one. So those are the kind. Transparency will help us a lot. But to kind of to get like the whole world to embrace the DSA or the democratic world to embrace the DSA and implement it, I think that is unrealistic.
Well, I was actually going to ask David, because I could see you almost about to comment there for your thoughts on this, and add one piece to it, which is in terms of winning the hearts and minds, and this being how we rebuild trust. What can the technology itself, how maybe can that be modified or business models be shifted so that it's not a loss for companies to do things that build trust and help win back the hearts and minds of people?
Well, I think the good news is that a lot of the technical solutions that the DSA is requiring of the tech companies have a significant upfront cost to implement, but the marginal cost to expanding them to other jurisdictions outside of the European Union is relatively small because the companies learn how to do it. For example, researcher access. The DSA has broad implications for how researchers in Europe from European institutions, they can have collaborators in other parts of the world, but how they can get access to platform data. Now, it's pretty hard for the companies to set up a portal, an interface for these researchers that does not disclose the personally identifiable information, violate people's privacy, and get researchers the information they need to do their research about elections in the EU. But once the companies build those tools to comply with the DSA, it's not that much more expensive for them to simply make them accessible to researchers in other parts of the world and to civil society organizations. And so I think that's where there's this sort of 1-2, or maybe it's 1-2-3 punch, where it's like the DSA comes in and says, you got to do this stuff for Europe. Maybe California shows up next and says, you need to do this for California too. And then maybe the UN shows up and says, we'd also like to know how many content moderators there are in Myanmar and Angola. By the way, it's pretty sure it's more than one, but they can't live in Myanmar, so they're probably in Dublin or places like that, or Singapore. But that is so important. I think another thing that we can't underestimate is the difference in experience of these platforms for people who have low levels of literacy and low digital literacy. The process to report something on YouTube or TikTok or X or Facebook, just to say, I think I'm being harassed, or I think this is misinformation, is pretty complicated for someone who has a graduate degree and lives in the United States and is using the platforms in their native language. Imagine if you're in a country where maybe the interface doesn't exist in your native language, or maybe you have low literacy, or maybe you're just uncomfortable with technology tools. Trying to figure out how to report some kind of violating content is very, very difficult. And so across all the platforms, it's pretty clear that there's deep underreporting in places like Myanmar and Angola, probably amongst a broad swath of the population because they don't understand how to report, they don't know that they can report, and then amongst maybe an educated part of those populations because maybe they've tried to do it once or twice and they've had no action, no response because of the lack of investment and infrastructure. But I think maybe another piece of this is the companies really, it's not just about having someone who speaks those languages on staff. It's about affording the people who speak those languages a measure of proactivity in their work. Because of this problem of massive underreporting, lack of understanding of what's going on the platforms, you need people who work for the platforms who not only speak the languages, but who are experts in the history and politics and slang and up to date on that in each of these countries, and who can take action and investigate things in proactive ways. Right now, the posture of so many of the platforms is only reactive enforcement, only move in on something, either if it's reported by an actual user, or oftentimes it's actually the case that they only move on something after it is a public relations disaster for the company.
This goes back to that issue earlier about trust, and the public relations disaster. I used to be a press officer. It's actually a very effective way to get people to do something that needs to be done. I'm not suggesting that we do that on purpose, but it leads to this other question of how do we make sure that companies are incentivized not just to be reactive. You mentioned something earlier about the business model. Facebook tries to do a thing with time well spent and then loses users to TikTok. Is there something that can be done outside in the external environment with regulations, perhaps? That's not just a stick with fines, but incentives to take action and take proactive measures. And this is sort of a broad question to anyone who would like to tackle this. Yes, Commissioner.
No, I just wanted to mention an important project that my office is engaged in, and we have the colleagues here who are working on this and have been working on this since 2019. And I think it's a good practice model. It's our so-called, we call it BTech project. And it's essentially a community of practice to work with the big tech companies on, there are these guiding principles on business and human rights that were adopted in 2011. And how do we translate these responsibilities that companies have into concrete business conduct when it comes to human rights compliance? Because of course, in the traditional sense, human rights were always seen violations by the state, and we haven't looked enough at non-state actors. And as you know, in so many respects, the power, and it's always about power dynamics when it comes to human rights. So you need to address these power dynamics, and you need to find ways and means to mitigate the abuse and the risks that go along with, frankly, the consensus on which the society is built, which is human rights. So we started this BTech project, and I think it has been extremely helpful because, to be honest, in the past, it was actually very difficult conversation with tech companies or generally with businesses about human rights. We were saying, oh my goodness, this is sensitive, this is uncomfortable, we want to, so it was a real shyness and staying away from it. That has actually changed massively. So we do have these discussions with tech companies, with their corporate lawyers, but in particular with, and if they have established, and most of them now have established, human rights teams who work through these various issues precisely when it comes to elections, so that there is enough resources going into the various issues that you have that are coming up for election integrity, for example. But what we need is the transparency. We need the data. We need to know exactly how is this happening, and we need to public reporting on it. And we need it not just for the big ones, also for the smaller ones. So we actually want to extend this BTech project to Africa and Asia as well, because we know the world is not just the Bay Area.
So, that's actually perfect segue to ask about the compliance deadline that's coming up this weekend. So this is precisely the kind of point you were making. I think that we need to make sure that we're having transparency, not just from very large platforms, not just focused on what's happening here in the Bay Area or in Geneva or Brussels, but everyone across the board. So Prabhat, I'm wondering, what do you hope to see with this deadline that is upcoming that will make sure that all of the players involved are reporting in a different kind of way?
Yes. So, I mean, transparency is really at the core of what we're doing. And what we see, I mean, sometimes I describe the DSA as a kind of, a diagnostic machine, like a kind of apparatus that you put onto a patient in a hospital, and you get all sorts of signals, and okay, some of these signals can only be read by a doctor, but there's also some other material that can be read by our normal users. For example, the DSA requires readable terms and conditions, actually in language that can be understood by children, so and this is actually true for all platforms, whether they're big or small, and it's not just for the main social media sites that we're talking about. So there's a lot of user-facing transparency. I need to explain what kind of restrictions they have in place, and so there's what we are starting to see now also with journalists and researchers is like an enormous amount of research and analysis going on understanding what kind of information can be extracted from these transparency reports. We have a database which is managed by the European Commission that takes a record of every content moderation decision that has ever been taken and has 3 billion entries at the moment. But it can be queried by an API. And we ran a hackathon a couple of weeks ago here in Brussels with on the same weekend as a big open source kind of tech event, and we had 88 participants, basically from computer science graduate schools, trying to kind of compete on running artificial intelligence chatbots that could interrogate our transparency database, you know, and extract insights, you know, and the winning team got a really cool product out in one day on just ingesting a lot of this information from this database. So we can answer questions like on language, how many content moderators are there in my particular language, you know, but how many content moderation decisions have been taken when it comes to kind of hate speech or child sexual abuse material, those kind of things. How many restrictions, how many times have people been shadow banned on this particular platform in this particular language? So these are the kind of questions that we can answer now, and it's really shining a light onto things. And it's early days, and of course we need tools like dashboards, which we have put in place, and hacks and so on, that we will that, you know, that people can now start to parse. And we've seen this has global effect, and we've just recently heard from the Australian e-safety commissioner, Julie Grant, who's kind of used the European transparency reports actually to force some of the platforms to disclose data, similar to what David was saying, because the marginal cost of doing the same thing for Australia is actually so limited, you know, that they could leverage the transparency reporting from the EU also to get information about concerns that they had in Australia. So I think it's early days, like Gerard said. We have many more tools that still need to be deployed in the future. You know, there will be audit reports that will be made public, lots of information for experts and civil society to pore over. The risk assessment reports will be published later on in November this year. And then we have a very complex system, but also very important system on allowing independent researchers to look under the hood of these platforms to research risks and get access to data. And of course, us as regulators, we also can access kind of the company's internal technological systems to interrogate them. When, for example, when we're not sure whether the queues are sufficiently moderated or you know, or whether the policies are effectively implemented, like Naomi was telling us on some of the decisions that the oversight board has been making. So all of these things can actually now be verified, and I think this is a really new important tool, and not only verified, like Gerard is absolutely right, not only because of us, but because of the collective wisdom of people who are going to exercise a degree of accountability over that.
This is an excellent point that you're making about how these regulations have created all this data that now will be accessible to researchers and journalists and people from civil society in all kinds of different roles. And will be very interesting to see how that develops. So given that, we're going to move into the question portion of the event. We're going to start with the ambassador in Geneva from Norway, who is been one of the co-organizers of the event, but also we want to make sure that we are not just thinking about what's happening here in the room, but also what you're seeing with your colleagues in Geneva, and what the kind of hopes and expectations are about these new regulations and how they might transform things with the digital environment. Ambassador, please.
Super, thank you very much, and thank you for letting me be part of this very important conversation. I'm pretending to be in the midst of all the flags of the member states of the UN. This is a fake. I'm in my office, but you know, the signal is, of course, something that I think the High Commissioner and I will agree on, that global norms need to be one element in the emerging governance that we need in this area. I think the risks and the magnitude of the risks that we are up against have been described quite accurately. But I just want to drive that point home from a government perspective by saying that, of course, trust in the political system is fundamental for the ability of any government to govern, and including, you know, for our ability to have resilience against modern warfare. That is always today preceded by the misinformation campaigns. So this is, you know, apart from being a democracy question, is also a security policy question, which comes to mind speaking to you from a Europe that is seeing war on its continent. So given this situation, we have this enormous paradox that the hardest currency that democratic governments is dealing in, the trust, is largely, you know, influenced by private companies that are operating in a more or less unregulated space. And that is something that we need to really look at. I think that the good news, number one, is that we have an existing set of norms that is globally accepted, which is the human rights. And like the High Commissioner has said, there are clever people in his office working to derive from that set of norms, guidelines and guardrails also for the use of tech and social media. And the good news, number two, I think, is that the EU, the regulatory superpower, and the only sort of big economy in the world that are able, I think, to really govern this in a hard way is putting forward this hard regulation. The question, of course, with anything voluntary is how to find the leverage points to ensure adherence. And I think we need to look at what investors can do and maybe also the users. I mean, how can users of social media platforms globally say, well, we expect you to follow this and the other norms? Good news number three is, of course, that there are a lot of things that governments can do to stimulate what is the antidote to sort of polarized political debate online, which is an informed, and trusted public discourse, be it through support to fact-checking, to local media, like we do to quite a large extent in my country, so that people have something that they can trust as an alternative to sort of rabbit holes and other phenomena in the internet sphere. And maybe just for the sake of balance, let me add towards the end that, of course, political discourse online is in principle a positive thing. That's something that gives agency and influence to individuals. So it's the moderation of the content through algorithm that we need to really have a hard look at, I think. But again, thank you so much for including me and for making it possible for me to speak to you in the Bay Area. Like I said, I think there's a need for us to connect different worlds here, and I'm certainly in one, and I think we need to work together to get this right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And this is a wonderful time to turn to the audience, where we have representatives not just from the United Nations and the EU, but from all kinds of different institutions and organizations. We're going to take 3 questions, and then we'll turn back to the panel members who can respond in the first round. So we will bring the mic to whoever would like to go first. We also have some questions on online.
Sir, for the gentleman who spoke of Karl Popper, he did wonderful work on the poverty of historicism. You addressed that directly. The interaction among European Union members, the contingency in that wonderful example. Could you comment a little further? You seem to be on the knife edge of something that is literally global importance, renewed more than I'd ever imagined before.
Thank you. We'll take the second question.
Hi, my name is Baltz, the Consul General of Switzerland. I would like to have a question on the underlying structures of democracy, the formation of opinion, and how this is influenced by the new language models, and on how these language models are trained. We see that there is a big lack of transparency on the current training of these language models, and what comes out of these trainings is the future perception of the world of every voting citizen. Can you say something on how you would tackle this problem? Thank you very much.
Great. So there are 2 questions there, and I'm going to use also the one online question for this first round. So just to summarize, the first question is on the comments about Karl Popper that you had made earlier, and if there is anything you would like to expand on with the role of the EU and its in this new environment with rebuilding trust. The second one, which is also about trust, comes from online, which is the role of journalists. So what kind of role can journalists play in helping to restore trust? And is that in fact their responsibility, to paraphrase slightly? And then this final question from our Swiss colleague is about how public opinion itself is going to be informed by the way that large language models are trained and what we can do about that. So If any of the panelists would like to tackle any of the questions in any order, please let me know. I see David over on this end there. If you could pass it. Thank you so much.
Well, the role of journalists should be to receive lots of money from the platforms because that's not what they're currently doing. And it should support their work. I mean, it's so difficult to be a journalist or a journalism organization right now. Some of the journalism organizations have been hit for many years by losing their own ad revenues to ad revenues that go to tech companies that serve up headlines of their content or snippets or their entire content. And then also now, to add insult to injury, the language models, to the other question, are being trained without the consent of so many journalists around the world on the copyrighted material that they have produced. And that is, I mean, it's a disgrace. So there should be royalties and they should be paid for their copyrighted work. I think that's very important. I wanted to go a little more into that question, though, about the large language models. I'm so excited that it appears that the EU AI Act will pass with the provision requiring transparency of use of copyrighted data in the training of models. That doesn't make it illegal, I should clarify, but at least it sets up an opportunity for people to know who they need to sue, to perhaps get some remuneration for the use or abuse of their content. Another dimension of this that's extremely worrisome is the training of some of the image generation models, not large language models, but we learned a couple months ago, after some excellent work by researchers at Stanford, that one of the most popular open source image generators, Stable Diffusion, not the latest version, but an earlier version, was trained on child sexual abuse material. When you train an AI system on child sexual abuse material, it becomes very good at producing child sexual abuse material. And that is extremely worrisome. It's disgusting. And it was probably not the intent of the investors who invested in that company. It probably wasn't the intent of the investors who invested in companies that host those image generation models that are open source. You know, some of the investors who are in the buildings all around us put money into these venture-backed companies that are training on anything they grab. And the unfortunate thing also about the open source AI systems, generative AI tools like Stable Diffusion, the one trained on child sexual abuse material, is that even though in the later versions, the newer versions, maybe they've taken that out of the training set, the old version is going to be floating around the internet perhaps forever. So we see these release strategies of not securing, of just allowing anyone to get access to these systems that are built in very careless ways as quite dangerous. Another example is GPT-4chan, which some of you might have heard of. It's a large language model trained on hate speech from the website 4chan. And it's a large language model that produces maximally hateful hate speech to abuse anyone. That's open source. It's out on the internet. It was on a website called Hugging Face. They took it down, but I'm sure you can still find it somewhere. So I think that we can't underestimate the damage that can be done when people release in unsecured ways these tools to anyone who wants them. And if you were reading the news yesterday, you might have seen that OpenAI and Microsoft announced that their AI systems were being abused by state intelligence agencies in China, Russia, and Iran, who are trying to use those systems. Now, Meta didn't make an announcement about the Llama open source, quote unquote, it's not really open source, but the Llama AI system that they released being abused by those same actors, because the nature of their release is that they can't monitor it. When they let these things out into the wild, we have no idea who's using them. So thank you for that question.
Excellent points about intent of the technology that's created and then what happens when it is released to the wild and used in other ways. For the interest of time, I'm going to take a few more questions from the audience, and then we'll have a final round of comments from our panelists. Thank you so much.
Hi, Sonja Schmergelunde. I'm an AI ethics professor at the University of Florida. So thanks for the great discussion. My question is really like something fundamental to like the incentives that lay behind like the kind of conversations we have when we talk about regulations, and that is a market economy. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on like how tech regulation is not a regulation of a capitalist system and the incentives inherent in it.
Hello, Anne Flanagan with the Future of Privacy Forum. I'm so curious to get the panel's expert opinion on to what extent they think the EU AI Act will have an influence on the proliferation of deepfakes around the European elections. Obviously, the EU AI Act is sort of just in time, or will be just in time by then, but it won't be fully up and running. And I'm wondering if we're already hearing that companies are taking steps to ensure that they are following, I guess, the spirit of what's potentially going to come up in the EU AI Act, particularly around the deepfake space and elections. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question from the audience. In the back.
I have one question there.
Hi, I'm Mary Steiner, United Nations Association San Francisco chapter, and welcome. So we're very concerned about the lack of enforcement of the UN conventions on human rights, various conventions that have not been ratified here. But when it comes to implementing and enforcing them, it always comes back to data collection and being able to pay for the collection of data. And that is the case here in California for implementing or getting the convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women enforced. So how do you recommend working with the social media platforms in order to collect data? Would that be a very efficient and cost-effective methodology? And do you see any other conventions needed? For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child doesn't really speak to protecting children on the internet.
Thank you so much for these questions. And given the time constraints of some of our panelists, I want to make sure that we give some folks time to respond and also share their final remarks. So Prabhat, I'm going to turn to you first for perhaps this question on deepfakes that was asked, and also ask for your closing thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So in the Digital Services Act, I think there are two aspects to deepfakes in the context of elections, but also not in elections. For designated providers under the Digital Services Act, like all the main social media sites and the search engines, there's an obligation to assess risks that come from synthetic content, including deepfakes and so on, and then put in place mitigation measures for that. And they include watermarking and labeling, an effective channel to report and escalate deepfakes as well. So that's already in the text. So that's for systems that provide, that have to do that. And so in the election guidelines that were linked and mentioned earlier, we expand on that, and we provide a lot more detail on the way this should be done. And we welcome announcements of kind of corporations across industry, but the rules in the DSA are binding, and we can compel data on effectiveness of some of these mitigations, and compel data on measures that they have taken, how often such content has been taken down. So that's, I just want to stress that this is not only in the election context. Of course, there's a particular harm and a particular risk if somebody pretends, like what we've seen, and I mentioned it earlier in the European Union in previous elections as well. But also, of course, there's a whole category of harms around deepfakes, which have to do with kind of deepfake pornography, and we've seen it all in the news and so on. And this is something that is not outside of the election context. Also affects particularly young girls in the European Union, and it's a horrible crime. And this has also actually recently been criminalized just last week in the European Union in a uniform manner. So that's really the framework within, I think, the existing framework. And the AI Act that is not yet enforced, although it's been agreed and it's in the process of becoming law. I think it's passing the final hurdles in terms of just a final vote in the parliament. That will make it mandatory for people who kind of produce deepfake content, or allow it to be produced, to provide watermarks and labels and red team some of their processes as well. So And once that is law, I mean, the two laws will work together kind of hand in glove. But already for these elections that are coming up, the guidelines on which we're consulting right now provide an enforceable framework and also a verifiable and auditable framework. And I think that's also very important.
Thank you so much, Prabhat. We're going to start over at the end here with David and work our way this way with any responses to the questions about incentives in the marketplace, not just regulations, about the impacts on elections that are coming up right now, on enforcement of existing conventions such as the rights of the child, and also this question about deepfakes or any other topic related to this.
So many questions in there. I spoke so much on the last question. I'll be brief. A lot of people ask me about AI laws and most important AI laws and what do we need to know. The DSA is an AI law because the DSA talks about algorithms and abuses of algorithms and requires platforms to be transparent. I think a lot of people forget that generative AI is not the only kind of AI out there. Before that, there were many other kinds, self-driving cars, but also what in the industry we refer to as ranking and recommendation systems that are the AI systems that decide what's first, second, third, fourth, fifth place in your news feed as you're scrolling through any of the algorithmically or AI-based social platforms out there. So DSA, I think, is the law that will have the most important impact on the EU elections coming up because the AI Act won't be enforced also. And so DSA does have, many provisions that require the platforms to assess the risks to democracy of what their platforms are doing and the sharing of that. So that's what I'd say on that topic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think, with regards to AI, the platforms are starting to roll out some of these protections even before the AI Act is enforced. So we saw, right, that Meta last week, I believe, announced that they're going to start labeling all AI content. And the board has made recommendations around Meta's manipulated media content to the effect that it needs to deal with auditory manipulated media, right? Not just visually manipulated media, which is, in my opinion, one of the biggest threats to elections this year. For another example is the manipulated media policy currently only deals with people saying things they didn't say, not people doing things that they didn't do, right? So we are pushing for expansions to cover more of the use cases that we're seeing coming up all the time. And I think that these independent oversight bodies are going to play a role in kind of the run up as regulations are getting agreed and getting put into force.
Thank you so much. All right.
I mean, just quickly on the incentives. I mean, I think as I said earlier, the business model, I mean, the interest of the social media platforms is not aligned with the public interest. So, I mean, as policymakers, we talk about market failure. Yes, and then you need to come in and say, correct that market failure through legislation. So what's the incentive? I mean, for these companies, the incentive is money. And it's advertisers running away, of course, that can be done without regulation. It's the impact of like enforcement measures, it's people walking away from it. But that's I mean, it may be a little bit bold, but the change that you see at the moment in Silicon Valley here is all because of the EU regulatory framework, particularly the DSA, but not only the DSA. They will not do this out of their own free will. They will do this because they're forced to do this, and then we need to do it in a reasonable way. So the incentive is legislation. It's the driver. Whether we like it or not, it is the driver because there's market failure in this industry. The question on and I think it's also important, we focus on the DSA, but it is all, I mean, we have adopted more than 40 regulatory measures. So, I mean, hooray to the European Union's reputation for regulating. Yes, we're pretty good at regulating. So more than 40 in the digital area. Of course, we have GDPR, we have copyright, but the DSA, the DMA, the AI Act, we have the political advertising, which is also very critical in this space of election integrity. I mean, we have like the code of good practice on disinformation, I mean, terrorist conduct. So there's a whole amalgam of regulations that all interact and work together. So they reinforce each other mutually. On the AI and the large language models, I mean, how are large language models trained? They're trained on the internet. And what can you say about kind of quality of data on the internet? It is not so very good. It's biased. If you ask, and it's not even about like some of the more horror type of scenarios. If you ask, like you prompt ChatGPT 4, like, well, show me a happy family. you'll get a white man and a white woman and 2 children. That's the happy family that you get. You don't ever get like a one-parent family or a black family or an Asian family. Because the internet is biased, and so that's biased is built in. And I think one of the good things, there's a lot of discussion about AI here, and it's very much about large language models and the risk that they pose and everything else. The European Union has regulated also on non-discrimination, on transparency, on accountability, etc. So if these type of models are going to be used in the European Union, particularly for decision making, and particularly in context where like there are material impacts on people, they must be trained on non-biased data, and the outcomes must be explainable, it must be transparent, and all of these things. That's a kind of interesting part of the debate that is lacking in this country. We focus very much on like maybe the future risk, and the future with AI is 2 years from now, 3 years from now. We don't focus enough, in my view, on the risk that exists today. Final comment, and again, always when you do policy making, always look underneath. What's the kind of the foundation that you found? I mean, in these areas, we have an ecosystem that is not conducive. I mean, it's very kind of concentrated ecosystem. Whether you look at it in social media, I mean, these companies are incredibly powerful companies. I mean, the EU is regulating 7 of the most rich, powerful companies in the world. I mean, I mean, I've been to like New Zealand and Australia talking about like DSA and DMA. The message that these countries get is, well, don't even think about following the EU because you will feel the consequences. We are going to pull out from your country if you are following down the road. So, and we're seeing the same happening in AI. A very limited number of companies that are basically running the large language model industry that is going to be like the complete underpinning of our economies and societies. And so again, if we want to think about what are the solutions to this, think about the structures that in a way are like, we're now looking at symptoms, but look at structures beneath. We need a much healthier ecosystem where the press, the European Media Freedom Act, I should have mentioned. I mean, we have like, I mean, where it's not down to the goodwill of like a limited number of companies that of course have major monetary interest and are looking at returns on their investment and they taking the decisions. And then of course the governments need to come in because these decisions are not always aligned with public interest. So, but look at like, how can we make the ecosystem healthier?
Thank you so much.
Just a couple of quick points and also in response to the questions or to some of the questions. The first one is, and I think it goes to this issue of democratic space. I think we're all really quite desperate about divisions and polarizations within societies, and frankly also at the international level. A binary view, either you're for or against something, there's nothing in between. You have this enemy and friend type binary worldview, and that is very damaging for a society, for any debate. And I think social media platforms, in the way that the business models are set up, because of very easy spread of hate speech, very easy whipping up of emotions on topics where you actually want to have a rational discussion, where you also want to have a discussion with the ones who disagree with you. And that doesn't happen anymore in the way that it should. And you know, migration topic is a big topic in Europe. It's going to be a big topic in the elections. You actually need an evidence-based, fact-based discussion that is solution-oriented and that actually is de-emotionalized. And if you actually have all the emotions go in with the prejudices, with the biases, with the anxieties and the fear, you actually create a space where dialogue is not possible, where a solution is not possible. And that's a bigger question that I think one needs to ask, how we are going to deal with the big challenges of our time when we don't have that space anymore, which is why I quoted Popper at the beginning. On generative AI, we did a big event yesterday at Stanford University to actually go through some of the human rights implications, both when it comes to the development of it, even the use case question, and the technology and the engineers that are developing things that they themselves admit to us, they may not necessarily know the unintended consequences of it. So that's, of course, a huge human rights issue. Because if you actually start, I mean, I quoted the poem by Goethe yesterday, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, because the apprentice, as you know, does all kinds of things because he thinks the magic spell will help him get on with the work until he realizes that he has let the genie out of the bottle and as a result cannot control. I mean, it becomes totally uncontrollable phenomena then become the new norm. And then the sorcerer comes back and thank God he sort of stops this by making sure that this magic spell is withdrawn. And that's really what AI is, as we understand it, is happening. So there are we need a lot of human rights impact assessments, human rights guardrails at the very start of it and then throughout the life cycle. On journalism, I mean, we need free, independent media and journalism. We need, and I hope that there will almost be a revival of journalism because we need actually more of that, because otherwise we actually end up in these very divided, polarized societies where fact checks are not being done anymore and things of that kind. So I hope that we could actually achieve. When it comes to human rights law is agnostic, whether it's not agnostic, it actually applies offline and online. So it doesn't make a distinction. So human rights obligations apply online as well. And that's actually the beauty of it. So we need to use this legally binding framework, and we need to find ways and means to ensure that the treaty bodies, that the Universal Periodic Review, that the Human Rights Council, I mean, we had the Norwegian ambassador in Geneva. There are actually a lot of discussions also within the human rights community precisely to make sure that these existing obligations are applied online as well.
Thank you so much for all of your comments. We've covered a tremendous amount of territory about the role of trust and integrity in elections and the rules and enforcement mechanisms. And I think it comes down to, it is all of our responsibility to do everything we can in everything all the time kind of approach. I, for one, am hopeful that we are having this conversation and this dialogue. Please join me in thanking our distinguished guests. And of course, to our hosts here with the EU and with the Norway Consul General. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you, Alexis. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and see you very soon here. We don't have time for more questions. I'm so sorry, but you can hang around and ask.